Okay, let's talk about the control types that we mentioned in the previous slide and understand that threats and vulnerabilities are everywhere. Okay, that's more or less common knowledge, and I'm sure everyone understands that. But just to drive that point home, we know that companies are targeted and hacked daily. It doesn't matter if you're a Fortune 500, a large major retailer, or a small mom and pop shop. There are assets that these various hacking groups and different organizations, they want to have access to that data, whether it's customer data, whether it is credit card information, or it might be proprietary intellectual property, if you will. Okay, and those threats continue to evolve over time. So just because you've mitigated risk or you've implemented some type of system to handle today's threats, that doesn't mean tomorrow, next week, next month, some new threat or some new vulnerability will be discovered that you then additionally need to mitigate against. Okay, it's not just a line in the sand and you say, okay, I'm done, you wash your hands and you say, I never have to touch it again. It goes on and on. It's a continuous iterative process. All right, so our controls are instituted to mitigate risk. Are we going to be able to ever completely eliminate risk from the environment? The answer is no. There is certain levels of risk that you just have to accept, and you have to understand, is it worth the amount of money and time and effort to mitigate, or do I just accept it and move on? So certain things, obviously, we want to reduce or mitigate. Other things, we just say it's not worth it. All right, but again, the controls are instituted to mitigate that risk, to protect our assets. Vulnerabilities are removed or minimized. And again, as I said previously, it's a fluid process and it needs to constantly evolve. It's not just a one and done. All right, so some control types that we want to be aware of are, first one is management controls. Well, management controls are typically applied by, as you might guess, an organization's management, hence the term. Okay, that can be managers, it can be executives. It doesn't necessarily have to just be a manager, quote unquote. It could be, from the top down, from the CEO or the CFO or CTO, whatever, on down. All right, and it focuses on decisions and the management of risk. Administrative controls that we basically identify, whether it's a risk or a vulnerability assessment. We can bring either a third party in to come in and do an assessment of our environment, or perhaps you have staff on site internal to the company yourself, or you may work for a third party that goes to other companies and does these types of risk and vulnerability assessments. So it revolves around the assessment, the planning, and then the certification and the accreditation of that security assessment. All right. So once all these things are done, you've assessed what needs to be, or what gaps basically exist. You kind of understand what the threats are, what your assets are, and where the gap between those two lie. Then you plan, okay, what are we going to do to mitigate that? We're going to certify and basically understand that our plan is an effective one that needs to be followed. It doesn't do you much good if you have a plan in place that nobody follows. All right, so you want to have a written security policy. And basically, without having those things in place, without the audit, and without the written security policy, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to have your staff and your people follow that procedure or follow that common set of operating standards, because everybody wants to do things differently. On top of that, if you don't have something written in place, you don't have a written security policy, it's very hard to go back and basically hold someone accountable when you didn't tell them exactly what you want to accomplish to begin with. All right, so it's critical that an organization have a written security policy. All right, the next one is a control type, or as a control type, I should say, is operational controls. Operational controls are executed by people, the operators, and they're designed to increase individual and group system security. So as we go through this, understand that there are different levels and different types of security mitigations that can be put in place. Some are made by decision, some are made by people actually doing things, and then some are made by automated systems that are put in place. All right, so part of the operational control would be contingency planning and incident response. So again, as we go through our security policy and we go through our gap analysis and our security assessment, we understand that, okay, we can do everything that we can. We can put things in place. We can try to mitigate risk as much as possible. But what happens if they slip past our defenses? We need to now have contingency planning and incident response. It needs to be documented what happens in the event of a breach, who gets called, who gets notified, and phone trees, systems that might get spun up, so on and so forth. Okay, it just depends upon the nature of the business. We also need to make sure that we have change management and configuration management in place. That's critical, because if you have a large organization with different groups doing different types of things, making changes, if no one is kind of reviewing all of those things collectively, and all the people that are impacted by that change aren't aware of it, then it's very likely that a change made in one area could affect another area that people are unaware of. It could leave a gaping hole, so to speak, from a security perspective, that the security team or the infrastructure team or the application owners, that they may have done something last week and think everything's fine, but 2 weeks from now a change gets implemented they're not aware of. Then what happens? Well, that could potentially either back out or change things that they put in place 2-3 weeks ago. And now it could be a vulnerability that didn't exist. They don't know about it because they didn't know the change was made. All right, so I think you understand where we're going here. So it's important to have things documented and a change in configuration management system in place so that all of those changes, all of those things can be looked at holistically, and they can be communicated to all the parties that need to be aware. All right, so again, some other things: physical and personal security or personnel security. Very much like anything else, it has to be written, has to be in place, has to be documented procedures. The incident response, like I said, who gets called, what types of equipment needs to be brought potentially, what things need to be secured. Do you turn systems off? Do you leave them on? Are you trying to do captures of images of networks or systems or routers so that you can do forensic analysis later? Okay, there are all these different types of things need to be put in place so that we have a no guesswork kind of point of view. And if something happens, click, click, click. We're basically able to go in and just fire on all cylinders, and we know exactly what needs to be done. All right, because if you try to wing it at that moment, it's going to be too late. Something will be missed, and you could potentially destroy a critical piece of evidence. All right. So again, awareness and training, it kind of ties all of this together. Everybody that is involved needs to be aware. People that are going to be responding need to be trained and certified, whether it's annually or biannually. And we need to, as a company, understand that it's critical for our security posture, so to speak, that the training is taken and the policy is reviewed once or twice a year so that everyone is on the same page. Now, having said all that, is that something that people like to do? No. People hate having to take their annual, biannual certifications. That a lot of people look at it as a waste of time. It's every time we do these types of tests, whether it's a DR test or any type of thing where we're going to fail over and see if our systems work, or penetration testing or anything that deals with security, a lot of times people outside of the security space view that as an inconvenience. They view it as a waste of time, simply because it's taking away from their day-to-day operations. So yes, as you can see, sometimes you get some feedback. People don't necessarily want to comply with these things, but it is critical that people absolutely follow to the letter our security policies, and they understand that when they make a change, it needs to be communicated. All right, so I don't want to necessarily beat a dead horse here, but it's something that's very, very critical that a lot of times kind of gets brushed off to the side until the incident happens, and then all of a sudden people kind of scramble and scream, why weren't these things put in place to begin with? Okay, the next type of control is a technical control, and technical controls deal with computer systems. All right, they're automated, and they deal with some type of software or system for identification, for access control, or for audit. All right, so that could be, as an example, an access rule that we place on our firewall or our router. It could be our intrusion detection systems or prevention systems, okay, our unified threat management systems, things we've talked about previously. It could be strong encryption on our wireless access points, or it could be switch or port security, okay, or a myriad of other things. Basically, anything that we put in place to kind of automate the process of securing either our perimeter or our edge devices, things that are public facing, or it could be internal controls. We could have firewalls between subnets within our internal parts of our company to perhaps keep finance away from payroll, away from R&D, or away from engineering. We could create that isolation and separate various organizations within the company internally, even if it's not public facing or outwardly accessible. We could still cordon off and create those access controls so that we limit exposure even within the company internally. And then we could, as I said, mentioned previously, with intrusion detection or prevention systems, we can set things up so that we're alerted if some type of breach takes place, or we could automate the process even further and say, okay, something happens, we detect this type of breach, automatically kick off an audit or a logging system, or notify the administrators and so forth, but also turn on some type of other mitigation component, whether we shut down certain ports or whether we shut down access to certain parts of our network automatically. It just depends upon the industry and how sensitive that data is.